Now let us start with the standard trade model. We have seen three kinds of model up until now. We have seen Ricardian model, we have seen Hexerolian model, and we have also seen specific factors model. Now this model, the standard trade model, is going to include all three of them, right? It is a general model which is going to include all three of them. Well, if you look at the Ricardian model, then there was only one factor of production, labor, right? And it has answered few things. It has answered an essential question of comparative advantage, but it didn't tell much about the income distribution. In the specific factors model, there were more factors of production. You remember that? You had labor and capital. But then there was some factors which was specific to food and some factors which were specific to clothing. You remember that? We have done that in detail. It talked about the income distribution, at least in the short run, when the factors are fixed. In Hexerolian model, we went little further than that. So we started with Ricardian, in which only one factor production was there. We went to specific factors in which there were more than one factor and few factors were specific, fixed in to be used in the specific sectors only. In Hexerolian model, you can have all the factors that can move across the sectors, right? In food, in clothing, labor and capital can move. Although, yes, you have defined that one of the sector is going to be labor intensive, other sector is going to be capital intensive. You've defined all that. And there are differences in resources. So the country is endowed with the certain kind of resources. I mean, maybe my country is labor abundant, your country is capital abundant. So it is natural for me to produce more of the good which is going to use my abundant factor intensively. And it is natural for you to produce more of that good which is going to use your abundant factor more. It also talks about income distribution. So Ricardian model doesn't talk much about income distribution. Specific factors does in the short run, in the short run. And then Hexerolian model, it tells about the long run consequences on income distribution, right, of trade. Now you move on to the standard model, which is going to take up all of these models into it. And it will be answering few questions also. So no one model can actually answer all the questions. So we are talking about the standard model. And then when we have a specific question, we will go to a particular model which can answer that question, right? So we want to talk about comparative advantage. We want to talk about that few countries are growing at a very rapid pace. So what is driving that? Is it the comparative advantage? So we want to look at the Ricardian model there. So we'll try to answer things in terms of the standard trade model. And then for the specific questions, we'll go to the specific models, not the specific factor model only, the specific models, whether Ricardian, Hexerolian, or specific factors model. Now, this standard model is going to be based upon few key assumptions, key relations. One relation we're going to talk about between PPF and relative supply, production possibility frontier and the relative supply curve. We'll talk about the relationship between the relative prices and relative demand. How do you get the world equilibrium price? By the intersection of world relative supply and the world relative demand curves. And what is the effect of the terms of trade on the nation's welfare? This is what we're going to look at it. Different countries, they have different PPF. The reason being there can be differences in technology. That is what we have seen in the Ricardian model. Or there can be differences in the endowments, differences in resources. That is what you have seen in the Hexerolian model. Or there can be differences in both. You have the PPF, which is shown to you in this black line, right? So this is what the PPF is, and this is what my ISO value line is. So country is going to produce at a point where the ISO value line is going to be tangential to the PPF, right? Country is going to produce at the point where the ISO value line is tangential to PPF. And how do you write the ISO value line? Sorry. How do you write the ISO value line? That is PCQC plus PFQF equals to V bar, something like this, something like this. So you guys can write this as PCQC equals to V bar minus PFQF, or it's better for me to write in terms of PFQF. This is PFQF PCQC. I can write QF as V bar minus PF minus PC by PF QC, right? So this is what my ISO value lines are. So this is what is going to be my ISO value line. And the economy is going to produce at the point where ISO value line is tangential to the PPF. So it is tangential at this point, right? And it is producing, at this point, it is producing QC1 and QF1, QC1 of clothing and QF1 of cloth. So when the slope PC by PF1 is given, economy is producing QC by QF1. So this is the first point of the relative supply curve. Now, supposedly what happens is that the relative price of cloth increases, right? Relative price of cloth increases. So this thing will become steeper like this. This thing is going to become steeper like this. And the moment it becomes steeper, economy will start shifting its production from point E1 to point E2. At E2, economy is producing QC2. A different pencil for this. Right. So I'll be producing QC2 and QF2 out here. No? So what has happened? I'm producing more of QC and less of QF when PC by PF has increased, right? So basically what you have is that this QC by QF has increased. So in this ratio, your numerator has increased and denominator has fallen. So of course, QC by QF has increased. So what has happened is that when PC by PF has increased, economy has started producing more of this guy, relatives, more of cloth. This is the relative supply curve. This guy is the relative supply curve of the cloth, right? So not relative supply curve. This is the relative quantity of the cloth, right? QC by QF. This is the relative price of the cloth, right? Okay. Okay, so relative supply of cloth will rise as the relative price of cloth is going to rise. Fair enough. Okay. One thing is this. So we have derived the relative supply curve. Let's move on. Let's talk about the relative price and demand. Well, economy is going to demand, if economy is not trading, then whatever economy is producing, only that much economy can consume. There should not be any doubt in that. If economy is not trading at all, then whatever economy is producing, economy can only consume that much. Fair enough. Yes, that's right. So economy given PC by PF, that is the slope of the ISO value line, economy is going to find out what is the highest community indifference curve it can have. So is this the highest one? No. Oh, sorry. Is this the highest one? No. This one is the highest one. Where this indifference curve is tangential to the slope of the isovalue line. So economy is producing and consuming at the same point. How do we get the consumption? You know it from your micro theory also. Given the slope of the budget line, I'll be asking what is the highest indifference curve I can draw. Is this the highest one? No. This one is the highest one. So you're consuming out here. That's what in the similar way you have found this out here as well. So value of consumption is equal to value of production. So DC and DF is the consumption of cloth and food. QC and QF is the production of cloth and food. So what is the expenditure on consumption? PCQC, PCDC. And what is the value of production? PCQC plus PFQF. Right. So DC, DF are what your consumption of cloth and consumption of food. So at this point, the consumption of cloth and food are same. So when PC by PF is this guy, I should be rather saying that this guy is, okay, I'll make it like this. At this point, when the economy is not trading at all, then the amount of the demand and the supply is same. So this was your relative supply curve, which we have shown already. No, which we have shown already. I want it to be little up because this will unnecessarily create problem in like this. So I want it to be little up. Sorry, I'm making these changes within the video. So we have already shown that this guy is the relative supply curve. And this is also one of the point on the relative demand curve, because at this point, at this PC by PF, the amount of the relative quantity of cloth and the relative demand for cloth are same, right? And at this point, there is no trade which has happened. Now, supposedly, the price of cloth has increased, right? Price of cloth has increased. No? So it is PC by PF2. So you will be producing how much? This you have seen in the earlier part also, just a few minutes back. This is what you have. This is what you have been producing. That is QC2, QF2. Fair enough. Let's say this is given this slope of the isovalue line, the highest indifference curve, which is going to be tangential to this slope, is going to be what? Is going to be this IC2. So you move from point E1 to this point. I will rather say this point E3 because I have termed this point E2 as the production point. Okay. So which color I should use? I will use maybe this color. Right. Tuk, 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 tuk. So what has happened? What has happened? You are consuming DF2 of this, and you are consuming DC2 of this, right? When the relative price of cloth has increased. So what has happened here? When the relative price of cloth has increased, the relative consumption of cloth has decreased. No? Why I'm saying this? When the relative price of cloth has increased, PC by PF, it has increased. The relative consumption of cloth has decreased. Why I'm saying this? Earlier, what is the relative consumption of cloth? DC1 by DF1. Now, what is the relative consumption of cloth? DC2 by DF2. Why I'm saying it is lower? Look at the numerators. Look at the numerators out here. So the increase in DC is lesser than the increase in DF. No? Then the increase in DF. So you were sitting here earlier. Now you're sitting here. And you were consuming here this much of DC. Now you're consuming this much of DC. So what has happened is that DC by DF has decreased. Are you seeing this? So this is the increase in DC, and this much is the increase in DF. So the increase in numerator is less than the increase in denominator. So the fraction has fallen, right? And the consumption has shifted from E1 to E3. Fair enough. Okay. When the relative price has increased, the production has shifted from E1 to E2. Consumption has shifted from E1 to E3. Fair enough. So what has happened is, when the relative price of cloth has increased, relative consumption of cloth has decreased. Relative consumption of cloth has decreased, right? Here there are two effects which are occurring simultaneously. One is the income effect, and other one is the substitution effect. Income effect says what? Boss, relative price of cloth has increased. People who are producing cloth, their income has increased. So income effect says what? Basically consume more of both the commodities, right? They being both normal. So consume more of both. Consume more of both, right? And substitution effect says what? Substitution effect is very, very straightforward in its view. Whosoever price has decreased, consume less of it. So the relative price of cloth has increased, so the relative demand for cloth will fall. So it will say cloth has become relatively expensive, consume less of it. Substitution effect makes economy consume less C. Less C. And more F. Consume less C and more F, right? Achha. Then I just want to mark this point. PC by PF2. PC by PF2. So this is, let's say, that point. Your DC by DF2. So ultimately what has happened is that the substitution effect is overpowering the income effect, making the consumption of cloth relatively lesser as compared to the consumption of food. So when PC by PF has increased to PC by PF2, the consumption of cloth has decreased, right? So this is what my relative demand curve is. This guy is what my relative demand curve is. So this point is what you call as point E1. This one is the pre-trade equilibrium, right? Pre-trade equilibrium. And if you look at it carefully, then what has happened here is that at the given, let's say at this higher relative price of cloth, producers are going to produce more of cloth and consume less of cloth, and consumers are going to consume less of cloth. So the production is going to be more and the consumption is going to be lesser. So at PC by PF2, the production of cloth is going to be QC by QF2. No? So at this relative price of cloth, the production of cloth will be more, the supply of cloth will be more, and the demand for cloth will be less. So the country is going to export cloth, and hence import food. It is, since it is producing less of food, but its demand for food has increased, so it has to import food. Are you with me? So when PC by PF has increased, the country that exports cloth, because it is exporting cloth and its relative price has increased, that is going to be better off, right? So when PC by PF increases, country that exports cloth, country that exports cloth is better off, right? And conversely, you can say if PC by PF has increased, the country that is exporting food is going to be made worse off, right? So an increase in PC by PF is going to make the exporter of cloth better off, and it's going to make the exporter of food worse off. Okay. And a decrease in PC by PF will make the country overall better off. One thing is that. Okay. Because consumers can actually consume more of 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 uh, of cloth, right? Okay, so what has happened out here is that you have seen what is the standard trade model. We are still not over. We'll be talking about the terms of trade and many other things in the later parts of the model. So this is just the general introduction of the standard trade model. So you've sort of derived the relative supply curve and the relative demand curve. And you have seen in case of PC by PF is going to increase, what is going to happen. Huh? Okay. Thank you, Beta.